Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, having my monthly conversation with Thomas Caldwell. He is, of course, chairman of Caldwell Securities. Tom, inflation is down. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just down a little bit. Interest rates seem to be stable. What's your analysis of the situation currently?
The U.S. economy is doing extremely well. Inflation seems to be moderating somewhat, but these are short-term numbers. And as you know, I'm quite cynical about government numbers on inflation. Inflation has been, and always will be a permanent fact of life in democracies and also dictatorships. So my job as an investment advisor is to try to keep my clients' wealth and savings ahead of inflation, which is stealing their purchasing power. Whether it be housing prices, car prices, anything. Inflation is a permanent fact of life. Now, in Canada, we have a little bit different dynamic going. You're seeing that in Canadian economy, we're not chugging ahead as strongly as the U.S. is for a whole host of reasons.
Right.
So the Bank of Canada may be forced or may be influenced to cut interest rates before the Federal Reserve does in the United States. I think there's at least one cut coming, particularly in the U.S. It is an election era period.
Right.
And I'm not saying central banks are government or politically motivated or influenced, but they are, of course. But I think in Canada, we might have to cut first, just because the condition of our economy. And that would mean also a weaker dollar, because a lot of money, this high-powered money, moves back and forth in interest rate differentials. So it'll be interesting to see. But and short-term bumps in interest rates or inflation don't mean anything. The longer term, it's always going to be there at some level.
Indeed, indeed. Now, I know we don't usually talk tech. However, this antitrust case against Apple in the U.S., that's huge news, or potentially huge news. Let's put it that way. Do you make anything of it from your vantage point?
Governments are nervous about anything that could undercut their power. That's a truism, whether it be big companies, but certainly big companies with big information and big influence. So they're always going to see companies like Apple, et cetera, as highly threatening. And they will always have a skew to move in that direction. That, however, being said, they do want to maintain a degree of competition in basically electronic devices, in the internet, et cetera. And so they really are going to have to take a look at all of these companies, whether it be Apple, that's always tried to have a separate regime, a separate whole system, separate charges, everything that doesn't coincide with anything else. That makes them very unhappy, because they somehow, in government, particularly in the US and in Europe too, feel they should try to enshrine or ensure competition. And that seems to be the bottom of it. But I think the real thing is they don't like big companies with big influence. And Apple is clearly dominant, clearly a leader, and clearly tight with China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're always going to be looking at it. But they are trying to maintain a level of competition. This is big and complex. The regulators really don't know how to get their arms around the whole tech industry, artificial intelligence, everything. They're trying to get on top of it, and they can't. Somebody likened it to a great lumbering giant trying to catch up with a sprinter, and they can't quite do it.
They can't quite do it. Very interesting. Now, I will say, when I purchased my latest Apple smartphone, I had to buy a whole new suite of chargers. And I said, "What?" Because they've changed the input of that charger. And I said, "Why is this happening again?" And they said, "We've conformed to the European standards. So that's the European standard. They made it across the world. So now I had to buy, $100 worth of chargers because the Europeans decided that their standard is the world standard." So there you go. That's not Apple's fault. That's all I'm saying.
Well, yes and no. I'm a little bit more cynical than you. First off, I have cheap phones. I buy Samsung cheap stuff with universal chargers. Once everybody gets that, they're going to come back and say, we're switching back to the new North American standard.
Oh, no.
Have to do it all over again.
No, don't say that. Don't say that. We've got less than 30 seconds left. I do want to talk about, maybe I'll just give you the prelude for after the break, but
Okay.
U.S. government, here's a stat for you. U.S. government is now $35 trillion in debt. And now my obvious question would be, is that sustainable? But my real question is, does anyone care? I mean, you know, that should be a headline, but I'm not sure that it is. We'll be back with our guest, Thomas Caldwell, after the break. Perhaps he can help me answer that question. Please stay with us.